We're now on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis. Elalo Kash. So the Gemara now reconciles the theory between these two braisos. Ha diyamar haredi shochet al manas lekabel dama lemachar. Ha diyamar haredi mekabel dama al manas lishpoch shirayim lemachar. So we're talking about a machshavas pigul of chutz lizmano, which is classic. And the first brisa is referring to a case where he does the shechita, which is the intention of doing the Kabbalas Hadam tomorrow. Exactly how he's going to pull that off, I don't know, but that was his declaration. He declared that it's going to be received, the Dam is going to be received tomorrow. And that's Chutz L'Zman. In that case, the carbon becomes Pigul. But in the second Brisa, he made a declaration that I am going to receive the Dam Almanas, that the Shvicha Shirayim or the Aktar Simurim will be Chutz L'Zmano. That does not mafagel. That doesn't make the carbon pigul. Are you telling me that a machshavas pigul does not disqualify the carbon at the point of Shvichas Shirayim or Haktar Simurim? Vatanan, we learned in a Mishnah. But here the girsa should be a brisa. Yachol lo tehei machshava moelas el bachilas basar. Right, so that the Kohen did the avoda with the intention of eating the basar chutz zmano. And this price that we're learning now is ahava, meaning that that's the case of machshavas pigul. Minay l'rabo shvicha shirai v'aktar seimurim. What does it mean l'rabos? L'rabos means for pigul. Let's see if I'm right. Okay, I don't see it here in the notes, but that's my impression. Why the double language? So again, we're back to the old stira that we had before, because we came to the conclusion that during the avodas of Shvicha Shirayim and Aktar Simurim, there is no machshava hamafageles, and it doesn't create pigul. Here he's saying, Achas achilas odem achas achilas mizbeach, then in both cases, even achilas mizbeach, which includes Shvicha Shirayim al Yisod, or for sure Haktaris Haimurim, then there is a psul of machshavas pigul. Lo kasha. Hadi amareni zorik almanas lishpoch shirayim lemachar. Hadi amareni shofek shirayim almanas lahakter emurim lemachar. So if he has in mind to be zorik the dam and then be shofek shirayim tomorrow, chutz zmano, then in such a case, there's no machshavas pigul. But let me just read one more line. Hadi Amar Hareini Shofech Shirayim Manasa Hakter Mur L'Machar is then there's no machshavas pigul. So machshavas pigul is a posel, even with regard to Shvicha Shirayim, if he has that machshava at the time of the zrika. And he says, I have in mind that my shvicha shirai will be tomorrow, which is chutzes manu. So that machshava creates pigul. But if at the moment of shvicha shirayim he has in mind, for example, hakter emurim lemachar chutzes manu, that doesn't create pigul because the carbon is already kosher. It's already the kapar is already clinched. Om Rabbi Yehuda Berei Reb Chia Shamati Shetfilas Etzba Mifageles Bechatos Primis. Okay, a chatos primis has to be brought from the azara after the shechita. The dam is taken into the heichal, and it is offered on the mizbeach hapnimi, the mizbeach hazav. In order for the kohen to achieve this goal of applying the dam from the chatos onto the mizbeach hapnimi, he has to dip his fingers into the dam. That's called tfilas etzba. And if at that moment he has machshavas pigul, then says Rabbi Yehuda, it would passel the carbon and make it into pigul. Shema Ilfa, when Ilfa, great Tana, heard this, Amra Kami de Rav Pada, he said it over in the presence of Rav Pada. Amar, Rav Pada said, Klum lamadnu pigul el mishlamim. What's the source of the Torah for pigul? It's shlamim. Is malish shlamim she'ein tfilas etzba mefagelas bahen. In fact, there is tfilas etzba in shlamim, but it's not. The Torah didn't specify it. Just that there's no other way of his getting the dam onto his back without putting his finger in the dam. But in any case, there's no machsheves pigul in the case of shlamim during tfilas etzba. Is I might think that af chatos ain't tfilas etzba fagelos bahem. Chatos like shlamim, and shlamim, as we said, is the paradigm for the din of machshavas pigul. Would not have a machshavas pigul that's effective to create pigul at the time of tfilas etzba. Now, I'm just not sure if he's talking about a chatos pnimis. It says chatos here. Yeah, I think he's talking about a regular chatos. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, you're limiting yourself to shlomim, and therefore you're coming to the conclusion that the same din applies to chatas, and therefore you came to the conclusion that there's machshava hamafagelos at the time of tvilas etzba. We have a principle of dialav in a din minka. You can't go beyond the malamed. The malamed here is shlomim, and there's no psul of pigul in tvilas etzba with regard to shlomim. V'chi hakol mishlomim lamdu ima shlomim shalo lishma ein motzim midei pigul. What does that mean? Ein motzim midei pigul. If we shalo lishma, so the carbon is kosher. The point is if he shechted the shlomim shalo lishma, he said eino motzim midei pigul. Why? Pigul will apply because there's no psul in the carbon. If the carbon become possible anyway, then there's no din of pigul. He says one of the features of the pigul law is that a carbon becomes pigul only if it would otherwise be valid. But once there's a psul in the carbon, there's no machshavas pigul. And then after is going to be if you eat the basa with the chayv kares. So this whole din of machshavas pigul doesn't apply to shlomim. One second, I'm trying to see what did the Gemara say until now. So Gemara says that in Shlomim there's no psul of pigul in Tfilas Etzba. So why not? Because in Shlomim there's no psul of machshavas pigul in Tfilas Etzba. Torah never says anything about pigul in Tfilas Etzba. And chatos we're going to derive from Shlomim. So just like there's no machshavas pigul in Tfilas Etzba in Shlomim, so too there's no psul of Tfilas Etzba in chatos.
Right.
That's all, again, based on one premise, that everything that we know about pigul is derived from the paradigm in case of pigul, which is Shlomim. So the Gemara attacks this and says, wait a minute. What about the case of Shalol Lishma in Shlomim? There still is a machshavas pigul because, again, the korban is not possible. Is afchata Shalol Lishma ein motzim midei pigul? Am I going to say that there's machshavas pigul in chatos, even if the chatos was shechted Shalol Lishma? And it's possible. So you see that the derivation of the laws of machshavas pigul from Shlomim are not ironclad. There are going to be exceptions to the rule. Like, for example, in the case of Shalol Lishma in chatos, where even though in its parallel case in Shlomim there would be a machshavas pigul apostelos, but not in chatos. So in the case of chatos, where there's a psul of machshavas pigul, and that psul would apply even if in Shlomim there would be no machshavas pigul apostelos, that's because of ribuyi dekra. Now let's just see if he tells you here what the Ribui Kra is. No, I don't see it right now. Okay, so now let's get back to Tfilas Etzba. I'm going to say that in the case of Chatos Primis, where the Torah requires Tfilas Etzba on the part of the Kohen, there's going to be a Machshava Hamafagelis. He says the law of pigul varies in accordance with the characteristics of each korban. Does not necessarily follow the model of Shlomim, like we said before. Therefore, if an act that is deemed an avoda for a certain offering is performed with improper time attempt, that's machshavas pigul, then the korban is rendered pigul, even though that act would not be an avoda in the case of Shlomim. So since there's an avod of the Kohen of Tfilas Etzba for the sake of a chatos pnimis, if he does it with a machshavas chutz l'zmano, then the korban becomes pigul. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Ba'aliyah zu shamati, up in the attic I heard shetfilas etzba fagelis. So again, we're talking about a chatas pnimis, and tfilas etzba is a Torah mandate, a Torah requirement, and therefore machshavas pigul at the time of tfilas etzba poselis. Toi bar Reb Shimon Lakish had doubts about it. Klum lamdu pigul el bishlam ma'al shlam ain't tfilas etzba fagelis b'hem af chatas ain't tfilas fagelis b'hem. So Reish Lakish works with the premise that there's an ironclad equation between machshavas pigul in other korbanos and the original machshavas pigul of shlomim. And since in shlomim we said that there's no separate halacha of tfilas etzba, it's only a technicality, shall we say, and there's no machshava of pigul that would passel the korban at the time of tfilas etzba in shlomim, then the same din, says Reish Lakish, should apply even in chatos. So the Gemara again brings up the answer that we had before from Rabbi Shimon Levi, namely, v'chi kol mishlomim lamdu. Remember, we said before that there's certain dinim we could derive from shlomim, certain dinim we don't derive from shlomim. For example, is machshava fagelis in shlomim, even if he shechted the korban shelo lishma. Whereas in chatas, if he shechted the korban shelo lishma, the korban is possible, and that's motzi midei pigul. So I mal shlomim shelo lishma ein motzi midei pigul. Right, even if he had a machshava of shelo lishma, which does not passel the korban, and therefore the korban still lends itself to a machshavas pigul to generate an isa pigul af chata shelo lishma. Ein motzi midei pigul. One second. So I think you have to read Rabbi Shimon Levi's argument with a question mark at the end. That's where I got a little confused. He says, Av chata shelo lishma ein motzi midei pigul. That can't be. Because if the chatas was shelo lishma, then the korban is possible. So obviously there's no pigul. So we see that the laws of pigul change from shlomim to chatas. And therefore it's a false premise when you say that everything is derived from shlomim, and all the dinim that are derived from shlomim are equal to the malamed to shlomim itself. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, ein hakol mishlomim, ein hakol mishlomim lamdu. I think you have to read it in. He has a mistake. He reads it ein. It should be in. Yes, in. Hakol mishlomim lamdu. So he's challenging Rabbi Shimon Levi. Now you're going to ask me, what about a case of a chatos that was shechted shelo lishma, and therefore the chatos is possible, and therefore it's impossible to have a machshavas pigul. On that, Rabbi Yossi says, Hoel v'chutzlim komo posel b'shlomim, shelo lishmo posel b'chatos, ma chutzlim komo posel b'shlomim motzi midei pigul. Right, because if he has a machshava of chutzlim komo in shlomim, it passes the korban. Again, it's not pigul with the chiv karis, but it passes the korban. And in there, there's no pigul of chutz lizmano, because the korban is possible. Is af shelo lishma posel chatas motzir midei pigul. Just like you said in chutzim koma passes the korban in shlom, and therefore there's no pigul of chutz lizmano with a chiv karis for the achil sabosor. So too, by parallel, in the case of chatos, if he had a machshava shelo lishma and therefore the korban is possible, it's motzir midei pigul. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, mitzido tavra, which means that there's a like an illogical presentation here. Malachusim koma posel b'shlomim. Shekei noig b'chol Zevachim, right? Chutzli Mekomo is a posel, Maseches Chutzli Mekomo in all Zevachim. Tomer b'shalo l'shma she'ein noig el b'Pesach v'chatos bilvat. So we see that a Maseches Chutzli Mekomo is more chamur than a Maseches shelo l'shma, and therefore it's possible that the Chutzli Mekomo would therefore be mafkia pigul, and shelo l'shma will not be mafkia pigul. I don't get it. Being mafkia pigul is a chumra or a kula? I guess he's saying that the power of a machshavas chutzim komo in shlomim is so great and so profound that it applies in all karbanos. Therefore, with such a profound machshava of chutz limkomo, it would be mafkia midei pigul. Maybe it's like puzzled to the nth degree, plus, plus, plus. But chatas, which is relatively kal, because it doesn't apply, because the shelo l'shma chatas only applies to chatas and to Pesach, therefore it could very well be that psul of shelo l'shma is not profound enough, not chomer enough, to be mafkia pigul. Elamai islos meimar. So why do we say that a machshav shelo l'shma chatas prevents and is mafkia pigul? Davar aposel behem motzim midei pigul. Anything that passes the carbon removes the application of pigul. Davar ma'aki ben mevim lidei pigul. And that which is absolutely essential to the carbon lends itself to pigul. It's hachinami. Right, we're back to the case of chatos. Davar aposel ba motzim midei pigul. Davar ma'akiv ba mevil lidei pigul. Right, if you have machshava haposeles, that's mafkia pigul. But if you have machshava on the davar ma'akiv ba, which means it's critical to the kashrus, the validity of the carbon, is that mevil lidei pigul. What does that mean, mevil lidei pigul? Let me just see if he adds anything here. So these words, davar ma'akiv ba, is a reference to tfilas etzba in the case of a chatas pnimis, and that's ma'akiv ba. That's absolutely critical. And therefore, in such a case, if he had a machshavas pigul at the time of tfilas etzba, it would be mafagal lekarbon. So basically, what the Gemara is saying is that from Shlom we learned the general rules of pigul, but not all the specifics. Like, for example, we said a davar makiv ba mafkir midei pigul in the case of a machshavas shelo l'shma in chatos, where shelo l'shma in Shlomim doesn't register, there still would be pigul. And now we're giving another example that if you have tfilas etzba, and in one particular scenario, one particular category of a carbon, it's ma'akev, for example, chatas pnimis, then we're going to say that a machshavas pigul would passel the carbon. Even though the tfilas etzba in the case of shlomim would not generate a hafkah of what he calls motzi midei pigul. Rabbi Mori, Afanan Tanami, Tanina Zaklal, Kol Komates, Menosim, Bekliva, Molech, Maktir. So in all these cases, with regard to a carbon mincha, we have a machshava haposeles, and it makes it mincha into pigul, and that applies to all the avodos. Kmitza, Nesina Bekli, Molech, Maktir. So Gemara says the following: you're trying to create a parallel to the avodos of a zevach, bishlem komeis hainu shochet. Molech, hainu molech. Maktir nami hainu zoret. Elanosim v'kli my ninu. What does that mean? It's on the list here. It's nosim v'kli. What does that correspond to in a regular zevach? If you're going to say it's parallel to Kabbalah, the avod of Kabbalah is Hasam Memela, Hacha Iu Kashakil V'Ramin. Now the Kohen has to take the Kmitza and put it into another Kli. That he has to do himself. Right? It's not like the case of the dam that, on its own, it spurts into a vessel. Ella, but rather came into lo sagi to lo yoiv al korcha avoda chashuvi. Why is there a machsheves pigul in the case of nesina bekli, which we said doesn't parallel any of the avodos in Zevachim? And the answer is because if he doesn't put the komets into a kli, he's not mekadosh the komets, and the whole enterprise of the mincha goes down the tubes. If a kometz was not placed in a kli sharis, the mincha is possible. Al korchi avoda chashuvi here. Therefore, there's a machshavas pigul in the case of nesina b'kli, because if you don't put the komets into a kli, it's not kosher. Hachanami here too. Let's go back to now tvilas etzba badam. In the case of achatas pnimis, kemedlo sagidlo ovidle. It's an absolutely critical, indispensable part of the avoda as far as an inner chatas is concerned. Al korchi hainu halacha, and therefore we could categorize it as an avoda like holochas hadam in the case of achatas pnimis, and therefore, if he has an intention to be mefagel, when he dips his fingers into the dam, it will be pigul. One says, "Lo, liolam titomi l'kabbalah." I could say that putting the komets into a klisharis is similar to and parallel to the kabbalas adam in a case of a shchitas hazeva of kodshim. Udikamed hacham emela hasam iu kashakil v'yayiv. You told me that in the case of the dam that spurts automatically on its own into the kli, that's different than the case of a komets where the Kohen actively puts the komets into a kli. That doesn't bother me. The idi matan klihu. In both cases, you're involved in taking whether it's the dam or the komets and depositing it into a kli. Mali mimela, mali kashakil. It doesn't matter 1 inch whether it goes into the vessel on its own or someone takes it and puts it there. And that leads us to lema ketanoi here about whether machshavas pigul fagelas in the case of tfilas etzba. Lema ketanoi machlokes tanoim, which will mitzshem take up in the next sheet.